Arms at well.
The third national of the late 1863 until sometime in 64 when the fourth national, which was late in the war, came about and then finished the war. But the Battle of Resaca, this would have been the Confederate flag. Other than the battle flags, this would have been the flag flying.
And you were mentioning that your ancestor was actually in the battle.
Yes, he was here at Resaca, fought from Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, all the way to Big Shanty, which is next to Kennesaw Mountain, the Brushy Mountain line, I believe is what it was called. At that point, half or more of the 31st Alabama was captured while out on picket duty. They were out ahead of the main army when a surprise Union attack came in and captured the colonel, Colonel Hundley, quite a large number of the regular troops, one of which was my ancestor. Spent the rest of the war at Rock Island, Illinois prison.
What was his name?
J.L. Kendricks. He fought with two brothers and I believe a cousin, all Kendricks in the 31st Alabama. He was so sick from his time at Rock Island, when they finally signed papers, parole or whatever to be able to come home, he was so sick he died November, I think 11th, 1864. Hadn't made it home more than 2 months before he died, but he did make it through the war at least.
And he would have been camped right up over where the Confederate camp is
Yes, he would have
now.
been on the other side of the hill with Pettus Brigade, which was part of Stevenson's division, which was under John Hood, under Hood's corps.
And the Union, you said, marched right through here.
Yes. Terrain, I'm sure, looked a lot different, not as grown up. It would have been a lot clearer than it is right now, but this would have been the avenue of approach. You'd be looking at lines of Union troops coming up, going up over the hill to battle the Confederates.
Great. And what's your name?
Donnie Penhale.
Donnie Penhale.
Yes.
I saw one guy with a little handgun. Follow up.
And this is the Confederate camp set up about a hill over the other Union camp. And I was talking to a pretty old reenactor up over the hill there, and he said back in my younger days, there'd be plenty of fights between the two camps, usually at night between the younger guys, and he thought it was really funny. But yeah, I mentioned I saw the same thing happening with reenactments over in Europe. Around 160,000 men fought in the hills surrounding the town of Resaca, and of those, 7,000 would die. Many more were taken prisoner and would spend the remainder of the war either in Union or Confederate Army prison camps. And it's just intense to think of the scale of the fighting that took place here, so far north of Atlanta, kind of the opening salvo of the Atlanta campaign.
Sneak attack.
What team are you on? That one
I'm looking out over the northernmost part of Resaca battlefield, and I wanted to talk about an infamous action that was committed on May 14th, 1864. Basically, that morning, two divisions led by Brigadier Generals Judah and Cox made their way into this open field. Judah was supported on the right flank by Major General Palmer, and as they made their way through, differences in terrain led Brigadier General Judah to charge ahead, attempting to cross the creek bed here, where it's called Camp Creek, and it led him to charge up into the hills. Now, of course, basically 600 of his men died almost instantly. This is a very heavily forested area, and the Confederates had every opportunity to see them coming, and the rest of them actually hid in the creek bed. So several days later, on May 18th, he was relieved of his command for performing this action. Now you can kind of understand the logic of the Union Army because Hood and Hardee, two Confederate commanders, were encamped just to the west of this field on the ridge over here across the creek. And by making a launch into the heart of their position, they figured they could dislodge them. Of course, it went south very quickly, and it was mainly a difference in terrain. In any case, the battle began on the 14th, and by the 18th, General Schofield totally relieved of command General Judah for attempting to cross this creek bed. Now, again, 600 men died in and around this creek, and the rest of his division tried hiding here, taking constant fire by Confederate forces who were concealed and had set up camp around the town because the Union Army for several weeks had been making moves on North Georgia, the beginning of the Atlanta campaign. And all throughout this wood line here, you had Confederate encampments and trenches that had been set up only in the previous days, because Resaca was a very small town, but it was kind of a railroad hub that would lead to a terminus, now called Atlanta. And here you had Hood, Hardee, Cleburne, Cheatham, Hindman, and Stevenson. And of course the initial attack was on the 14th, well, not the initial attack, but by the 14th they tried to launch a desperate charge in which hundreds of men died, and they were forced to retreat, the Union Army was. It's hard to imagine in 2023 the horrors that must have been felt by the men on the ground here. The Union Army would have advanced from the town of Resaca and around this position towards Confederate lines, which were clear across an open field. It would have made them totally exposed, and of course a lot of Union generals were ordering them to simply charge the position. Now, after the war, there's a big debate. Did they charge because of differences in terrain, or did they charge because they wanted glory? And the Confederates would do the same thing. And usually what happened was very wealthy officers who could buy their commissions would send hundreds of men to their death in countless charges, and they were mainly just seeking honor and glory. Usually those officers would survive to the end of the war and write their memoirs.
jump off.
Oh, I couldn't fall.
Yeah. Oh, Phil.
Phil. I dropped him down. Oh, no, Phil.
My introduction to the history of the battle at Resaca came from a short story written by Union Army veteran Ambrose Bierce, who was in reality present at the battle, although the story itself is a clever fiction. And in the story he writes about a Union Army lieutenant that served alongside him named Lieutenant Braille. And Braille was a danger to everybody else in that unit. He said that Braille was over 6 feet tall, and he was demonstrating a weird level of bravery to the point of being foolish. In fact, on the day of the battle, and he's already at the beginning of the story establishing a number of times where as battles go on, he is seen, while everybody else is crouching in the trenches or hugging the earth as though they loved it, he is seen standing head high and facing the worst enemy fire. Well, he is eventually killed at the Battle of Resaca, and the way this happens is that, true to form, because Bierce was actually at this battle, he says that the troops on the Union side were in a sort of semicircle hugging the wood line, and before them was an open field, the opposite side of which held Confederate defensive positions. And Braille was ordered to deliver a letter to the other end of their semicircle. Well, Braille decided to take the shortest path between the 2 points and ride right in the middle of the open field. And immediately the commanding officer of the Union side says, "Go get that fool." Well, the man who goes out on horseback to get him is shot within 10 meters, and Braille continues as though nothing has happened. After Braille's comrade is felled for trying to go and rescue him and bring him back to Union lines, the Confederates open fire, and the Union wastes no time. There's a charge, people are dying left and right, and the author purports to look out across the field and see 6-foot-plus Braille just standing there. And he mentions, true to form because he was a surveyor, that there was a defile in the center of the battlefield that he could have easily ducked into. He, in fact, calls it a miracle. And he says that if only Braille had ducked down, he would have been saved. And as soon as Braille was felled by a Confederate bullet, it seemed that the firing stopped. The Confederates had a din, and they gave him an honorable burial and returned the bodies, and they shook hands with Union officers. And so, as the author is going to California, he's looking through Lieutenant Braille's personal belongings and finds a hidden compartment in one of his leather bags that has a love letter from a woman to him. And in this love letter, the woman says, "Well, I heard from an officer in Virginia that he saw you crouching behind a tree in the middle of the fire. And I could deal with the loss of my loved one, but I could not deal with hearing news of his cowardice." So from that point on, Braille would charge into enemy fire, he would refuse to take any kind of cover, and he would, in general, just endanger the lives of the men who fought alongside him. And so the author of this story decides to go and deliver this letter back to his girlfriend. And the letter had a bit of blood on it. So the woman reads the letter and her face lights up and she's very happy. And then she looks at the stain and says, "Could that be?" "No." And the author says, "Yes, it's the blood of your former lover." And she tosses it into the fire. And the author goes and picks it up. And she goes, "Well, how did he die?" And he said, "He was bitten by a snake." First Civil War reenactment. I've been to a couple Indian Wars reenactments, but they only had a couple dozen people. This is more of a cultural thing. This is pretty cool. In my search for unusual and interesting variants of Southern flags, I found this one. Now, initially I thought it was the Ottoman flag, but the man here informed me that it was the flag of a battalion from South Carolina, but it was also one of the earliest secessionist flags. The South Carolina flag is a blue flag with a crescent moon in the upper corner. Now, they turned it red for war, and they added a star to harken back to the Bonnie Blue, which was flown by rebels who had taken West Florida, or East Florida, back in around the early 1800s, in an expression that they wanted their own independence from colonial powers, because at the time that part of Florida was not the US. And so the addition of a lone star was kind of harkening back to that, and of course Texas actually added a lone star on its flag to invoke the image of the Florida revolutionaries. And so some of the earliest Confederate flags featured a lone star, and in South Carolina, naturally, they would add a crescent moon. I should point out just how steeped in history this area is, because about 20 feet in front of that horse that I'm looking at right now, the Union Army would have advanced to the left about a mile for the main battle here at Resaca. But you've got cavalry reenactors out here who brought plenty of horses, and later in the day they're going to go out on the field. Now, this is the 159th anniversary, but the 160th next year is likely to be a much larger event, so I would encourage everybody to go. And you got over here the reenactors themselves.
Are you going? Yeah, that's Chips and Larkin Expedition. Just really, I'm curious. Oh no! It just came out of nowhere. Oh no! Oh, this is just like a game. It just come out of nowhere. Oh.
Following trees.